Welcome to the Made for Agriculture podcast.
I'm your host, Landry Jones, and today we are going to be discussing spring herd cattle management. I've got a couple experts here with me today to help me lead that conversation. And so before we get started, let's just get to these folks and have them introduce themselves, who they are and what they do. Dustin, you're kind of on the top of my screen here, so I'll turn it over to you. Let folks know who you are and kind of what you do here for MFA.
Sure. I'm Dustin Vore. I'm field nutritionist for MFA Incorporated. I work in the southern part of Missouri in the field and consulting with locations and producers as far as, cattle rations, etc.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, Mr. Tony Martin, Dr. Tony Martin, excuse me. Go ahead.
Mr. Doctor, at least you didn't call me Mrs. We'll go that way. Yes, this is Tony Martin. I am the staff veterinarian for MFA Incorporated. I base out of Columbia, but I'm essentially a resource person available for all of our stores and our end user customers for animal health and veterinary product information, and be able to answer questions and help educate and make sure we're selecting the right products for the right use at the right time. Just whatever we can do to help producers make the right decisions on providing the best inputs for maintaining good animal health. So been doing that for a lot of years, and I get all over our potential trade territory. So I'm at the home office, like I say, but I try my best to be out in the field as much as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could all say that the more we're out in the field, the better we are.
Yep.
Yeah, and if folks remember, I don't remember how time flies. It's been a couple, 3 months ago. I had Dr. Martin on and David Moore, and we were just kind of discussing some things around herd management, pasture management, and at that time, screwworm was a pretty big deal, and still is. And so I guess let's just kind of start there, Doc. Give us kind of some background of, and maybe people didn't listen to that podcast. I guess just kind of give us an overview of what the New World screwworm is, and then maybe just an update on kind of where we're at, the latest news on it, and we can kind of go from there.
Sure. It's been in the news a lot, so most everybody that's in the livestock production world has at least heard about it somewhere, but there may be some that still haven't got filled in on details. We'll touch on a few of them, but probably the biggest question I continue to get is what's new about it, because that title New World screwworm tends to have some people thinking it's a new and dastardly organism that's new to the world, and it's not. It's the same screwworm that is it almost endemic in the United States long ago. I think the last break we had in the United States was in 1982, and that was down the Florida Keys. So it was eradicated then, but it has continued to exist, and it's endemic in countries like Cuba and I think Haiti, Dominican Republic, and a lot of the South American, several of the Central American countries. The U.S.'s effort to keep it out and try and remain screwworm free has been primarily the use of the best control program out there. Really, the only one that's worked really well is that sterile fly program, and they've been involved with different production facilities to produce enough of those sterile male flies and get them distributed in southern Mexico and keep that screwworm at least contained down close to the Panama Canal, down in that area, and keep it from coming north. But what has occurred over the last several months is that it has broken through that particular wall of prevention they've tried to put up, and it's moved its way north. And the latest one, which has a heightened concern and keeps the Mexican border closed down across Texas to the Mexican cattle that are normally part of our beef production system up here, is the fact that it's now, the latest report, within 50 miles of the Texas border. It's in one of those northern Mexican states that really has, last I read, that particular state has a 230-mile long border to the Texas border. So it's like one of our counties next to each other, I guess. It's very close. So it has a lot of concern. If it gets over in this country, it could spread around. I have a Texas colleague veterinarian down there, who tells me it's going to get into Texas, he thinks, sometime this year. And he said he thinks it'll probably come across in either a wildlife or some kind of a pet coming over it. It requires someone carrying the larva or something carrying the larva in a wound. This particular fly is not a whole lot different than the normal flies that can lay eggs in wounds and create maggots, but the difference is this particular one, the larval form of it actually is like a corkscrew, and it screws down through the dead tissue that maggots normally will consume and goes right into fresh tissue, and it can actually start consuming an animal alive, eat it alive, so to speak. And that's the worst part of it. It gets so deep, it creates a lot of pain, a real nasty wound, and it's one that we definitely want to keep out because it can infect any mammal that has an open wound, and that's how it gets started. So the concern is there. Most of the awareness is at the Texas border, but for those of our customers, some of them are backgrounders. They source cattle through livestock markets or elsewhere. You just need to be aware of where your cattle are coming from if you're working with that kind of livestock, and if you're getting replacement stock, be aware of where it's coming from so that you lessen the chance that it's coming from one of those border states where we bringing it up here in this area. And if you got livestock of your own already, just be checking the wounds. I don't suspect we're going to see any screwworm here in Missouri, and we haven't had it, but you never know. You need to be aware.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm not too old, and we won't talk about who's oldest on this podcast, but there might be a person here that would remember when it was here, and that was maybe back in the 70s. Is that right? Or somewhere back in that time frame. Is that how did people manage it then? And is it really going to be any different if or when it comes up where folks that might be listening to this have to deal with it?
No, we're not going to treat it any different. The fly itself doesn't move very far. That's why I say it's going to come across on a pet or wildlife. It's going to come across probably one of the larvae in a wound is what it'll do. And as that larva matures, drops out, and then becomes a fly, those flies, they say their limited range is only a few miles, but when the animal starts transporting, that's when the larva can spread out a long ways. It responds the same as any other fly to most of our insecticides that we would use to get things under control. The biggest things is if a person would have a livestock or an animal with a wound that has those larvae in it, is spraying the products like the normal screwworm balm that we've had on the shelves for a lot of years. That product still stays there and has the same name. You spray it on the wounds and it will boil those larvae up out of it, and making sure those larvae are killed where they don't mature into a fly that can then keep up the cycle, because each of those female flies can lay up to 3,000 eggs during their short life cycle of 21 to maybe 30 days at the most. I don't think most of them last that long, but that's why they use the sterile fly program, sterile males, because those particular flies, the females only mate once, and then if you mate to a sterile male, their eggs are not fertile and they don't hatch, and you stop the larval production. So you wouldn't handle a break of it any different than you would with handling the normal presence of fly larvae and wounds. We just hope we don't see a lot of it.
Well, I think that's probably obviously when it gets talked about on the news, and when something like this can even affect the cattle market or the futures, it gets people's attention. And it's kind of one of those, we don't want to say it, potentially black swan events that cattle producers are all well aware of that affect the markets. But is it, I guess in your professional opinion, is it something that is devastating? I feel like we're kind of, as cattle producers, we're kind of already doing some of these best management practices already without the New World screwworm being here. If we're castrating calves, and then I'm kind of speaking for myself, but I would assume a lot of the we're spraying it with some sort of a larval insecticide to make sure that maggots don't get on it. Or if we're dehorning cattle, we're treating that wound. I guess, is there anything different that people may need to do in their practice or on their operation if this New World screwworm was to, say, show up in Missouri, in a year or two or three or whatever? Or is there, I guess, just kind of walk me through what maybe producers should be doing or are already doing. I guess, is it just mainly taking care of, having good animal husbandry of open wounds? Is that really about all we can do at this point, or even when if it does show up?
And the last part of your statement summarizes it well. It's if you're currently practicing good animal husbandry and managing things as you should, about control of external parasites around animals and being observant for wounds, you're going to stay ahead of and or prevent any involvement of this New World screwworm if and when it would ever get here, because it, like I say, it is prevented by the normal parasite control things that we're going to talk about a little later in this podcast as we move away from this particular subject. But it's where we get away from you is somebody that only sees their livestock maybe twice a week, something like that, and it's not real observant, maybe doesn't have facilities to get sprays on them to keep the flies under control, that's a place where it would really get out of control. Or if it would get into the deer population, that gets a little tougher too. But that's why they're being so diligent at the border to keep it down there if it gets across, contain it early, and then push it back way down south where it's endemic and see if we can't keep it from ever getting back up here again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, like I said, that's just
Yeah.
wanted to kind of bring some light to that, because I don't know, like I said, when we hear it in the news, it's doom and gloom, and I feel like some of these things we're already doing as cattle producers, there's not going to change a whole lot. We may need to be a little bit more vigilant and keep an eye on things, but as far as really changing a whole lot, if you're already doing some good practices, I don't know if there's really much we can do other than just kind of be observant and try to control it as best we can. So
That's well said. Yep.
Well, let's kind of pivot from one insect disease to another. All three of us actually last week, I believe, were at a stalker conference, and they had some good presentations on some of the other insect diseases that we might be facing as cattle producers. And one of those is the Theileria disease, the tick disease, that's kind of new. Well, is at least being discussed. It might have been here for a while, but at least it's kind of rearing its ugly head, and producers are taking acknowledgement of it. And it is obviously probably can be detrimental to livestock. Again, I think it kind of goes back to just good animal husbandry practices, but kind of bring us up to speed on what that disease is. Kind of where it's currently located, especially in our trade territory here in Missouri. And then also we'll kind of roll into maybe some management things that folks can do to help mitigate that.
Yeah, sure. Theileria, yeah, as an organism, it's actually a parasite. It's not a bacteria like anaplasma is, and we'll talk a little bit about anaplasma along with this discussion because they clinically present so much alike. But Theileria is a bloodborne parasite. It actually can infect both red blood cells and white blood cells, which probably, even though we don't totally understand yet, in my mind, is one reason why it creates a few different things than what we see with anaplasma. But it's a bloodborne parasite. The family of Theileria has a lot of subfamily members, and some of those subfamily members have been in the United States, have been identified in Missouri for several years, but they really don't create clinical problems. But this new one, if you want to use the full word, this Theileria orientalis ikeda, the genus, species, and subspecies, this is the one that has been causing the problem since about 2017. That's when they first noticed it, and they noticed it in Virginia. It has been strongly associated with also the identification of the Asian longhorn tick, which is a kind of a new tick to the area. And so as this developed in Virginia in 2017 and they started looking for it harder and spread the word about it, they now have identified this particular clinical disease causing Theileria in over 20 states. And as you bring it closer to home here in the state of Missouri, the first clinical case, if I remember right, and I'm doing this from memory, I apologize, I didn't drag the notes out, but I think it was in Howell County in the summer of 2023. So that's when they first identified. And since then, as they started looking for the longhorn, the Asian tick, Asian longhorn tick, they have found it in Missouri in, I believe, 9 counties or 7 counties. 9 counties they found the tick. I saw my notes on that one. And it's currently, they have identified Theileria positive animals by the different PCR testing they do in 60 of Missouri's counties. So it's here. Now, has it created clinical disease in every one of those 60 counties? We don't really know because the clinical disease it presents looks so much like anaplasma. And if you're a Missourian and got cattle, anaplasma is endemic here. So we're used to dealing with that. We have the feed-through antibiotic CTC that we deal with every year to try and at least help keep it at bay because anaplasma will respond to chlorotetracycline, but we don't have that luxury with Theileria, and that's what's creating a lot of the concern about it. Is this disease will create an anemia and create cattle that are basically exercise intolerant. They're going to be slow to move around just because they don't have enough oxygen moving in the blood. It creates death loss in severely clinically affected animals and looks a lot like anaplasma in the later stages. The difference about Theileria is that as opposed to anaplasma is a disease we're used to seeing primarily in animals that are 2 years of age or older. It tends to clinically affect adults. We don't really see it much in young stock because being a bloodborne parasite, anaplasma, the immune system in young animals can fight it off pretty well. As opposed to Theileria being a bloodborne parasite, for some reason, and I think it has a factor related to where it could actually infect white cells also, it has the ability to kill even young stock. And that's one of the biggest concerns with it. I talked with a Dr. Lammers out in Virginia, who was one of the first ones involved with that. He's on the staff at the University of Virginia, or Virginia Tech out there. And he said when he went through herds out there the first year, he said you'd see some death loss in cows, which is what we think about with anaplasma. But he said the second year on those herds, you'd start seeing some late-term abortions. And he said the third year is where they started seeing the increase in calf mortality. So that's the kind of thing and that kind of history that would make a person want to at least perk up and learn all they can about it and make sure they're alert for it. Because Dr. Lammers tends to think it's dose related. A lot of herds, since there is no treatment for it, just to try and get the entire herd exposed and try and control that exposure and keep the animals in good condition where they can build up immunity, and then you just deal with a herd that's endemically infected with it. And that's kind of what we do with anaplasma. So I think in spite of having 2 or 3 instances in Missouri where they had some pretty significant early death loss, that what we're going to see is probably a rolling occurrence of this like anaplasma. It may go right along with anaplasma. So we'll just have to learn to live with it. I don't know whether they will come up with an approved drug for it. There is one that's approved overseas, but it's not got any at least any hint of being considered by the FDA to be approved in this country. It would create a significantly long pre-harvest withdrawal if we went to using that drug. So that's the biggest obstacle in front of it. It's one that we have to have some concern about. But again, this one, if you want to minimize the effect of it, we want to minimize the amount of exposure they get to it, which really boils down to trying controlling the vectors that spread it around. And so any blood-sucking insect or that can transfer from one animal to another could transfer this disease, but it is most strongly associated with that Asian longhorn tick. But in my mind, it could be passed by sucking lice. It could be passed by other ticks also. We just don't know that for sure. But so if you'll exercise all the efforts you can toward external parasite control, again, ticks, flies, those kind of things, it should help minimize or at least dampen the level of exposure as this particular organism moves around the state, where maybe if you're doing the other things about good animal husbandry and feeding that Dustin could speak to when we're talking about those kind of things later in the podcast, if you keep them in good health and supporting a good immune system and try and dampen the amount of dose that they're actually seeing of these infectious organisms, their immune system be effective in fighting it off and preventing the clinical losses that are so devastating, especially with this hot cattle market.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so, I mean, I'm getting kind of a general theme here of the two, you want to call them diseases that you talked about so far, and it just kind of rolls into where we are in the year right now. We're in, it's March 5th, and the spring has sprung. I mean, we are supposed to be 70 this week. We've hit 70 several times in February. Soil temps, I was looking on a completely different topic, but was looking at soil temps in regards to forage growth, and we've got abnormally high soil temps. And so I think I actually was talking with somebody, or maybe I was somewhere listening to someone on a talk, and they were saying that they were already finding some ticks, guys out maybe looking for deer antlers or something, and finding some ticks. So it's that time of year. It doesn't maybe necessarily look like it on the calendar, but it's that time of year where we need to be thinking about these things and how we're going to combat some of these pests. And I think with the talk that you just gave on these two topics, the two diseases, it's even more important. I think, obviously New World screwworm isn't here, but it's just, again, it kind of goes back to doing the right thing for our animals will help hopefully solve some of these upcoming diseases or insect problems that we're seeing across the country. And obviously, Theileria being here in the state already is something that we need to be mindful of. So, with that, I guess we'll kind of pivot a little bit. But um, and Dustin, I'll bring you maybe into this conversation. It doesn't. Maybe we've had it for a while, and I just wasn't aware of it. But it, a decade or 2 decades ago, it seems like really our only option for fly control was maybe topical treatment of animals or premise sprays around barns and congregating areas and things like that. But obviously, we've got some other products out now, whether it be fly tags or even things that we can put in our feed and mineral. So I guess talk people through maybe more from the mineral feed standpoint. What are some products? I see, like, for instance, I see Clarifly or Alticid or some of these products, manufacturer products in some of our products, whether it be our Ricochet mineral or what it might be. And I guess just kind of talk people through maybe what the difference is on some of those products. Is there one better than others? Even from a fly tag to or maybe it's all the above. Maybe that's what we should be doing. Is we probably should be doing, we should be treating these animals topically with the fly spray. We should be putting ear tags in them when we're weaning them. And obviously feeding them a mineral or a supplement that's got this sort of product in it. But I guess kind of walk people through what some of these products are and how they can be beneficial, maybe how they're used best, however you want to take it, man. Just kind of let folks know what's out there for them.
Sure. So we really, on the feed through side, we have two different products, and you mentioned them both, Alticid and Clarifly. Those are really the two predominant that are on the market today. The biggest difference in the two is one's an IGR, insect growth regulator, and the other is a true larvicide. The Clarifly is going to be labeled for house flies, stable flies, face flies, and horn flies, whereas the IGR or the Alticid is only going to be labeled for the horn fly. So when we look at using those two products, I mean, we have it in a broad spectrum of products across the board, and we can add it to specialty products as well within species regulation, obviously. So when we look at that, we typically will skew the Clarifly more towards a confined feeding operation, because you're going to see more house flies and stable flies in those instances. Whereas in a true pasture setting, we really worry more about the horn fly. Most of the research, I think, has showed that you can lose 0.2 pounds per day based on horn flies if you get a true heavy infestation, which I think 200 is the threshold. I'll let Doc correct me on that if I'm wrong, but 200
you're right.
flies, I believe, is the threshold for where you need to be pro or reactive in treating for that. So when you look at today's prices, even at $4 calves, if you have a 0.2 pound loss per day, that's 80 cents you're losing per day, which is significant when you look at the price of some of these feed throughs just as a preventative. Now, maintenance on property, if you have giant piles of manure here or piles of old nasty hay from last fall, you're probably going to see a lot more flies, and you're probably going to want to look at using some of the other products as well, whether that's a back rub with some dust or something on it, or dust bags, or premise sprays, etc., trying to get that under control.
Yeah. Are those, sorry, let me cut you off. The Clarify and Alticid, those feed through products, are they essentially just keeping those flies from hatching on the manure? Like, kind of walk me through how that feed through product is decreasing the fly population.
Sure. So the feed through does nothing in the animals. It goes straight through and into the manure.
Okay.
And so what it does is it breaks that growth cycle at the larval stage, so they don't hatch out. So it takes a little while, I believe 2 weeks, before you start seeing some of that get through and start to make a difference. The main thing on the horn flies, the reason why we typically just skew towards that Alticid product, is horn flies are kind of don't like to fly very far. So usually it works fairly well in a pasture setting, provided you've got good sanitation and aren't just piling stuff up or overgrazing, etc.
Right, right. Well, and I think, yeah, so a couple points there, that one that you mentioned, and then one that kind of came to mind as you were talking is, again, it's March. It takes some time for that product to get through the animal and actually start working. So I feel like it's not too early to probably start thinking about utilizing that product. And be mindful. It's one of those things also, and correct me if I'm wrong, Doc or Dustin, but you kind of, once you start using it, for it to be effective, you need to continue using it through fly season. If you break that cycle and go to a non-treated product, then you're kind of starting all over again for the most part, and giving those flies an opportunity to breed and increase that population. Would that be correct? I mean, once you start, you kind of need to keep on it.
Sure, like I said, it doesn't build up in the animal. It doesn't, it goes straight through into the manure. That's what we're trying to do with that. So you definitely, if you want to see results and, get the most of return on your investment for using the product, you definitely need to remain on it.
Yeah.
And especially it's even more critical nowadays. I mean, look at this winter. I live down here in southern Missouri, and we've had two snow events, and only one of them was any accumulation. So I'd say we're going to see if we continue this trend, we're going to see flies very, very early. So I already am feeding it, but I would recommend feeding it already. And as warm as we're getting in the wintertime, really from a cost perspective, it's not significant. So feeding it year round is really not a bad idea at this point either.
Right. And the other thing you mentioned there that maybe got to thinking, you were kind of singing my song on pasture management and rotating. I think that's another thing that we could do to kind of help, if these cattle are parked in one field the whole summer, then obviously, if you're not using a product that is, a growth regulator or a feed through product like that, then we're left to essentially just treating the animals at that point. But we're not doing anything for the breeding grounds of those flies or those insects. So, keeping good pasture management, rotating them cattle around, maybe dragging pastures to help break up some of that manure so that it doesn't provide that optimal place for breeding and reproduction in those manure piles would probably be beneficial as well. But, yeah, so, it sounds like the feed through products, fly tags, is and maybe Doc, this would be more towards you. What's kind of the useful time frame of fly tags? Like how long, if I put something in now, because I'm going to be weaning some calves, or at least here in the next probably 30 days, is it something that I need do I get a couple months out? And maybe it depends on the product, but how long can I expect to get some control out of those fly tags? How many do I need per animal? Can you kind of enlighten us maybe on a little bit of that?
Sure. Those fly tags, they do have a place as part of what we're describing as an integrated pest management, where you're using more than one line of defense to try and keep flies under control or keep these external parasites. The fly tags you mentioned, claimed for multiple species. There's not a one of them has any kind of duration of activity list for longer than 5 months. That would be a maximum under best conditions and under somewhat reasonable fly pressure, but we know how heavy the fly pressure can get in some areas. And so if you want I would expect the strongest control to be for a 3, maybe 4 month period. It's going to tail off toward the end. You definitely need to put 2 tags in your adults. If you're using a lighter tag, you could put 2 tags in calves. Most people will put 1 tag in, but it ought to be 2 in the adults, 1 in each ear, and 1 in the calves. And just recognize what the limitations are. It's only for that 3 to 5 month period, so you need to probably wait until the pressure gets high enough to justify putting them in. The people that put them in now, if you get the 5 months out, those tags are going to be dead during the time when we have some of the heaviest fly pressure around. But what you've mentioned already before, I've seen one fly hatch already last month. It got warm enough in my place that flies were in the barn. So not put them in now. Let's wait till normally June, something like that, where you could end of May, first part of June, where you could have heavy coverage during their summer months when they may be congregating areas where they're going to build up manure piles under trees and stuff where the flies will hatch, and they got more fly pressure to keep them knocked down. So the other thing about the fly tags, and I still see it today, it shouldn't have to remind people, but I still feel like we do, is that the fly tags, when they've reached the end of their expected effective lifespan, that 5-month period, they need to be cutting them out each year. If you leave them in, there's enough residual there. That's one of the contributors to resistant fly populations on the different chemicals that are there. And the fly tags are still, I don't know, there's still 9 or 10 of them left on the market, and there's a mix of pyrethroids and organophosphates, a combination of the two, and even one that uses an avermectin compound, that XP820 tag. But producers need to be aware of which one of those chemical tools they're using, and alternate those things when it comes to fly tags to expect to have effectiveness 1 year after another. So I think those are the biggest points about using the fly tags. They are effective, but 2 per adult, at least 1 per calf, and make sure you don't put them in too early, and don't leave them in year round.
Okay. Well, and you mentioned it there, and I was trying to think of the word to kind of bring all this together, but it seems like it's a integrated pest management, and I think it takes all of these things to make it successful. And so, whether it is fly tags or spray, spraying down our animals or feed through product, I think to be completely successful, we really need to be looking at all three of those at some point throughout the year. Like you said, maybe like I said, the feed through products we start now, the fly tags, when fly populations start to really increase, and then have that animal spray that we can treat those animals. I've been seeing a lot of things on social media of fly sprayers, that sit on the back of a pickup, pretty small units. I'm actually thinking about trying to get one of those, or even maybe make one, because it seems like a pretty low cost way to treat animals. I've even been known to sit on the back of my pickup with a water gun, squirt gun, and with fly control, and hit our animals. So I think any way that you can do it to help reduce that, because not only is it obviously limiting disease, it's also limiting our weight gains that we're getting on these animals that we need now more than ever with the prices where they're at. So I'm going to probably shift gears here just a little bit and talk a little bit about herd management, and more specifically creep feeding or mineral supplementation. And Dustin, being our resident nutritional expert here on the podcast, I'll roll this back over to you again. But I think, and again, I'm just kind of thinking through this as myself being a cattle producer, and I'm sure a lot of folks out there are probably doing the same. When you see a 400-pound calf bringing $2,600 at the sale barn, sometimes that makes us not want to hold on to these animals any longer than we have to, even though that's probably not the right thing to do. But we've got calves that are, fall calves, or even spring calves starting out here now in March coming on. I think creep feeding is a management tool that kind of gets overlooked, especially when cattle markets are high, because what's it matter a whole lot to some degree, I'm sure, is going through some folks' heads. So I guess walk through, and we obviously know the benefits of creep feeding, but if somebody's going to do it, and I think now is more, if I can put an extra 50, 100 pounds on that calf while it's still next to its mama, before I wean it, that's a lot of money in today's market. And sometimes I think we kind of think the opposite. When the market's high, we may not be obviously too concerned with that, because it's like it's still a lot of money at the end of the day. But when the calves are cheaper, then it seems like we maybe get a little bit more concerned about it. But I almost feel like it should be the opposite. The market we're in now, we should probably be looking at creep feeding more so now than ever, to try to just maximize our calf check at the end of the year. So I'll kind of shut up. I'll throw this over to you, but just if somebody's looking at creep feeding calves, what do they need to be looking at? Nutritional requirements, protein, energy. Are we talking about commodity feeds? Are we talking about blend of, just kind of walk people through that may not have done it or used to it, how they kind of get started and what they should be looking for?
So a lot of that's going to depend, based on commodity feed versus cattle charge versus full throttle, et cetera, is management. If you're putting it out in a old wooden feeder that has no gates on it, then you're probably going to want to excuse something maybe that's got a limiter in it, or like a cadence product, to keep those calves from just pouring through it. Not letting a feeder run out is also another huge issue, especially using a commodity feed or something that's going to have high levels of corn. We typically look, to 12, 13 protein on a creek feed. It's going to depend, vastly dependent on obviously what size animals, et cetera, that you're trying to creek feed. It takes a little bit of time to get them used to it. So if you go in there with, say, cow charge or Rumensin, that Rumensin is going to hold them back a little while, so you're going to have to pay attention to that. Really, the whole thing comes down to just management of that just like managing a bunk in a feed yard, et cetera. You got to manage that creek feeder to be able to be successful at it. If they're in there just not eating anything, it's not doing you any good. But if they're also hammering down at 3% body weight, then you could have some issues. So we really got to position the products based on management of that bunk. But standard products that we would have would be, cattle charge. Any of our cattle charge products are designed for a creek feeder, full throttle. You're going to want to manage that one a little bit more. It's going to gain a little bit faster than a little bit better conversion than the cattle charge. Got stalker grower, which is a little bit more of a commodity, more type meal mix. It's going to be a little more cost effective. Your gains aren't going to be as good as say on a cattle charge. Cattle charge is probably going to convert, 4 to 3.5 to 4 to 1, versus like full throttle is going to be 3.5 to 1. And I'd say on the stalker growers, probably 6 to 1, maybe. Mm-hmm. And that's pounds of feed to pound of gain is what I mean by that conversion ratio.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, sorry, again, just to cut you off.
Oh, go ahead.
And so like that, the full throttle, the cadence, the cattle charge, those are, obviously MFA products and they're tried and true tested products, feed products, that our nutritionist, yourself and Dr. White have put a lot of effort into making sure that they're, the best products out there, the best quality. And so that comes with a little higher price tag, right? That's one thing that people probably see, or when they're shopping around for feed, is those branded products versus the commodity products. But when you're talking, almost double the feed conversion, that price point is not as much of a sticking point, or it shouldn't be. If I can feed half the feed and get the same gain as what I can on a commodity, or, same thing, double the pounds of gain on half the feed, then that price point is a little bit mute at that point, or it should be if you're looking at ROI and the cost of it, and not only the quality, right, just the actual product, it not caking up, being in a pelleted type form. There's a lot of benefits that come with that higher price tag sometimes. And I'm, probably as a livestock owner, it seems like we're probably all guilty of trying to shop around and find the cheapest product, right? That's, unfortunately, a lot of times in the past several years, margins are tight. And so sometimes that's what you got to do. Now margins are not as tight as what they used to be. And I think we probably ought to be looking at some of those premium products. They're premium for a reason. It's not premium because we're making a bunch of more margin on them. They're premium because they're great products, not only from what's inside that pellet, but also how it feeds out and the animal performance on the backside of it. So, yeah, no, that's awesome. The kind of last thing I wanted to hit on here before I let you all go was just mineral supplementation. We're hitting spring. I know at least in our trade territory, needed to feed a high mag mineral or something to help with grass tetany is a real issue. So Dustin or Doc, whoever wants to kind of take this, I guess, walk through with producers with listeners here. Why is having a mineral with high mag important? And then is it something that do we need to be feeding high mag year round? Is it something we need to just worry about in the spring, like from a management standpoint, application standpoint? How do we need to be feeding that, and where does that come? Is like I know our Ricochet mineral products I've heard, and you guys can tell me this for sure, is that, if I'm feeding that year round, then I don't really need to worry about feeding a high mag mineral in the springtime. And sometimes those high mag mineral products, depending on obviously what product you use, it's tough to get those animals to consume that product because that magnesium is not very palatable. I've never tried it, but the cattle tell me it doesn't taste very good. And so anyways, I guess just kind of walk people through what that looks like from a mineral supplementation as we're going into heavy forage growth season now.
Sure. So cattle are going to have a magnesium requirement, which, on growing calves is going to be about 1/10 of a pound or 1/10% of their dry matter intake. You'll double that for, lactating beef cows. And then of course it's going to be higher for lactating dairy animals. So, if we're feeding a good quality mineral, like Ricochet, Super Tan, etc., those are going to have levels to meet those requirements. As long as those cattle are consuming the Ricochet or etc. Fortified mineral every day and getting their intakes, then we'll be fine. Now, saying that, there can be some outliers, obviously, but because you never know, every single cow is going to eat that every single day. But keeping it out year round, we've typically seen that there's not any issues feeding a complete mineral, as long as consumption is and bunk management is there. Don't let the mineral run out. Keep the mineral in front of them. Make sure it's not, caked up. Don't cut it with salt. We use salt as a regulator to regulate intake of those, so they don't go straight to the salt and not eat the mineral.
And that's true that's probably true. Obviously, even if you're just feeding a high mag mineral, right? Not every cow is probably going to, if they got to consume that correct amount of that high mag mineral to be effective. So it's not just the Ricochet deal. It's all of those, it's any product like that. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you're right. And most of the magnesium labels, back to your point a second ago, most of the high mag minerals are going to be a higher consumption rate simply because that magnesium is super bitter. So we have to cut it down a little bit more to get them to actually eat it, because Magox, I don't recommend trying it. It's fairly bitter.
So you have tried it?
No.
Oh.
Can't say that I have. Not purposely. But we just need to make sure we're getting the intakes that we need to make sure that we're meeting those requirements of those cows. So the main issue is in the spring, we get that high potassium content in those rapidly growing grasses, and we see a low magnesium. And so, if we get that magnesium over 2.2 times the sum of the calcium and the magnesium, then that's when we start seeing some issues. So as long as we're feeding that year round, you haven't had a susceptible, I would say if you've had issues in the past with grass tetany, there's probably some issues with no magnesium in the soil and there's no magnesium in your grass. So I would probably supplement a little heavier if you've had those issues in the past. Now, if you're on ground that you've supplemented, mineral year after year after year after year, the same mineral never had any issues, then I would feel confident in continuing with that program, utilizing, a good complete mineral to meet those needs. But if we see those issues is where we typically have the problems. But we can look at that on some of these tests and find out.
Okay.
Yeah, Landry, if you don't mind me jumping in.
Yeah, absolutely. I was gonna ask you a question. You may get ready to answer it, so go ahead.
No, just covering or adding to what Dustin has said. It's very true. Grass tetany is the concern that drives the questions about extra magnesium in the spring. And in my experience, in all my years of practice in veterinary medicine, those particular production systems that experienced grass tetany normally had significant holes in their management of the soil fertility, their forage management, and we're trying to feed the cheapest mineral you could. And the cheap minerals are ones that are made out of rocks, which are not very absorbable. And so you really don't want to try and play least cost when it comes to those particular micronutrients. When it comes to mineral balance, you want a good quality mineral and trace mineral that's readily absorbed, which is what's built into the Ricochet program. And if you're feeding that year round and you're keeping up with your soil tests and managing your forage right, I don't think you'll ever see any kind of grass tetany problems. So those kind of things come into play. It's not just the mineral you feed, it's how you manage the other components of what provides the nutrients for that cow herd to exist and produce for you.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. And I guess maybe tell listeners, Doc, maybe not what is grass tetany, but what are some symptomology symptoms. I can't even talk. What are some symptoms of grass tetany? What would people need to be looking for in their herd if they have issues with that?
Well, grass tetany, in my experience, will look an awful lot like a milk fever or the calcium problems in dairy cows. They basically will get imbalanced, unsteady on their feet, and they'll eventually go down, and they respond to an IV dose of a calcium, magnesium, and dextrose combination that we'd give them IV and try and bring them back around. But you got to catch them early because, in my experience, grass tetany, by the time it puts a cow down, is a whole lot less responsive to treatment than what the calcium deficiency or milk fever would be. But you'll see them basically with an incoordinated gait. If you're watching them close enough, often enough, you'll see them in that state before you just find one down and unable to get up.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I think we've covered everything that I wanted to cover. Did you all have anything that you wanted to mention?
Well, one other added thing, we were talking about the external parasite control products. We mentioned spraying, and I kind of wanted to add that people will spray for tick control, but you got to realize that the kind of spray we normally mist over them or put a light spray on for fly control is not going to get it. If you're having a tick problem on animals, you need a good soaking spray and make sure you're getting a spray on their underline and in the armpits and underneath their hind legs because that's where the ticks like to go, as opposed to your fly population, which stays on the surface. So the other part of tick control, I think probably mentioned too about brush and weed control. That's a part of good pasture management. If you're allowing part of them to get off in the brush and the weeds, maybe you need to fence them away from it or get in there somehow and knock the brush and weeds down because the ticks can sure get up on them that way. And um, I, th- I think that's, well, the last thing I mentioned, I put sanitation at the top of my list for most all those parasites, especially the fly control product, or fly control programs. And sanitation includes, as you mentioned, Landry, early on in some of your pastures, if you're intensely grazing, you may have some manure pats that are maintaining some pretty good presence out there. It may be good to drag those pastures once in a while and just break those things up if when the cattle aren't in there, just to spread your fertilizer out a little bit for one thing, but also do a better job of removing the environment for flies to lay eggs. And coming into spring, as people have been feeding big round bales in hay feeders, let's think about what it's going to take to clean some of that residue up because that's a good breeding ground for stable flies. You don't need to leave it in place as we're going into fly season. The ground's going to have to firm up before you can get in and peel those away. But the sanitation parts of it and around feed spills around buildings and maybe one last thing I'd throw in, we're talking about parasite control. I know it's going into spring and they won't be in the buildings as much, but don't ignore the rodent control around where your feed supplies are so they don't create an extra place for some of these external parasites to have a place to go and try and breed and create new populations. A good discussion, though. I appreciate everybody being involved with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I appreciate you guys joining us today, and hopefully the listeners found it useful. I think it's good to kind of bring some updates like this, especially when they're in the news, and then obviously rolling into spring. I think everybody's excited for that, and just to kind of discuss some things that people need to be looking out for as we roll into green grass and getting them cattle out grazing on the land. So. With that, gentlemen, I will let you all go. I appreciate you joining us. I thank everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you for listening to Made for Agriculture, brought to you by MFA, your whole farm solution.